Hey guys, and welcome back to Time Under Tension. This week we are rounding out our relationship series. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, would highly recommend you don't have to understand the context of this one, but I think it's really helpful to hear everything together as we approach different topics in the realm of mostly romantic relationships. And today we will be digging into the good stuff with trauma in relationships, which is something that we've both been very interested in studying. Dee has done a lot of training on this with her like life coaching preparation. And I'm really excited to kind of talk through how this can show up as it's something that is really common, and I think it's something that we need to become comfortable with talking about and being able to recognize, because I think through that sense of understanding, we can develop the grace and compassion that allows us to show up for both our partners with a sense of compassion, but also with ourselves so we can start to work through things effectively and not just repeat the patterns of usually our childhood or our more recent past within our relationships. So I'm
Yeah, definitely.
curious, what is your first experience with trauma in relationships in regards to like your training about it, or when was the first time you became interested in this?
Yeah. First of all, just want to reference it's super important that we call the attention to big T and little t trauma, if you want to word it that way. Everyone has experienced some sort of trauma in their life, and addressing trauma in a way of compassion and love for self is really going to jumpstart not only your own personal growth journey, but it's going to help you have a lot more grace, like be able to step outside of some behaviors, knowing that it's rooted in trauma. It's rooted in something that you might not even know happened, especially in my case. Or it could just be these patterns that you've associated so deeply with who you are that aren't actually who you are. They're just parts of you that aren't sure how to find security and safety in a situation and are coming out. And so it can really, really help your relationship flourish into something beautiful and grow into something that feels so much more healthy and fruitful in its nature. So I just wanted to put that out there because I thought what you said in the beginning was awesome. Just wanted to tag a little bit of more insight from my perspective into that. Um, to answer your question, really for me, I got really fascinated with trauma once I devoted myself 100% to working through my eating disorder and working through my struggle with body image. I realized over COVID that I did not have a spiritual root at all. And I knew that that's where I needed to begin growing as a person. I talk about my transformation a lot, and that's a lot more about discovering my spirit, discovering my being. And in that helped me to realize that as people, we are multifaceted beings, meaning we have multiple parts to us. It's not the same as saying, multiple personality disorder or anything like that. It's just that we have different parts of us that seem to show up when we're triggered or when a certain emotion happens or when we're in a particular social setting, environment, etc. So for us to think that we are one way all the time is totally not realistic. And addressing parts of me that showed up, I then asked the question, well, why are they showing up? And one of those main whys that I was really struggling with was why I could not let go of the way I was behaving in my eating disorder and the way I was behaving around body image. So I started, deep diving into trauma. And for me, I was one of those people that was like, I've never been through trauma. I've never experienced any trauma because I was only perceiving trauma as, having some sort of sexual abuse situation or like something really, really like PTSD, like, individuals who had come back from war. I was defining trauma as this really monumental experience that happened, instead of really understanding that trauma has this much more general definition to it that addresses a ton of just emotional abuse and little things that may have happened when you were a kid, that you got bullied one time, like that's going to affect you as a whole. So it was really just redefining trauma as a whole and being able to then take that understanding, applying it to my parts, and really unraveling bits and pieces of my behavior is what really triggered my desire to learn more about trauma and how it was affecting my relationship with myself at the time and my relationship with you at the time.
Definitely. And I think it's tempting to dismiss things that have happened in our lives when we get caught in the trap of comparison. And the older I get, the more I realize I feel like comparison is one of the most toxic habits that we have, because it not only usually reflects negatively on us, but it is very divisive in relationships. We compare to others in order to establish a sense of status or power. It's like we compare to against some bar that's being set. And with that, we create this like criteria of our performance or our appearance or our status in comparison to another person. And it's not only a dominance attempt, like, oh, I'm, more attractive or more popular than this person, and so I can feel validated. But it also goes the other way, where now we have this criteria, and if we're not meeting it, we're falling short, or if we meet someone who we perceive as being above us in this area, we are suddenly threatened because our sense of worth is not rooted in something solid. So that's a side note, really, but I think it really does matter when it comes to trauma, because I learned in nursing school and I was really ignorant to this when I learned it, and I thought it sounded ridiculous. We talked about trauma in my like psychology classes, and in talking about PTSD, there are instances of PTSD where people saw on TV 9/11, like all the things that happened around that. And people experienced PTSD just seeing it on TV. And I felt I was like young and critical and had not had many life experiences nor faced my own traumas. And I thought that's ridiculous. Like people are like actually on site there. They like deserve or have like earned PTSD, but how do you watch something on TV and have like PTSD from that? And now I see in my own life where these things that seemed small and I belittled in my own life, I've kept those stories for so long. I realize that there's trauma in them because they feel so heavy in my life. Even if I explain them to someone and feel like, well, this isn't that big of a deal. And I've been to therapy before where I've been like, well, like this thing happened, but I mean, it wasn't a big deal, or they didn't really mean it. But like, okay, I'm 27 now and I'm still remembering this story and the scene that played out around it. Clearly this had an impact on my psyche that goes way beyond like what actually happened in the physical realm. There was like an emotional threat or a threat to my safety that underlied this experience, and I have to honor that and acknowledge it if I want to move through it, because for some reason, because of that situation and the story I'm telling around it and the way that I felt as a child, I'm not feeling safe in a situation in which I feel triggered along the same vein.
Totally. I expand on that in terms of a relationship. So, can you give a specific example of, there's a story you're telling yourself because of a past trauma and you weren't aware that trauma may have been the source of that, how you've worked through that or realized the trauma and how that was showing up in relationship?
Yeah, so I've had some. a couple of caregivers, parental figures in my life who have been very like critical and aggressive and condescending. And naturally, I'm pretty mm, agreeable, I would say. Like, I don't tend to get into disagreements with people. I don't need to like assert my point or argue that is like not in my natural state. I do not want to debate things, whatever. So, if I'm in a situation in which I feel like someone is coming at me aggressively, my like immediate response is I'll go into freeze. So there we talk about like fight or flight. That's pretty commonly discussed when we talk about like sympathetic states of the nervous system. But another one is freeze. And it's not as common. Apparently, it's not really as safe because you're not really reacting at all, but it's what I've done because I remember as a child being yelled at, and if I fought back, they came at me more. Like, then we get the belt. Like, that's not gonna work for me. Or if I flee, I'm like put down and criticized for being whatever, a baby, whatever it was. And so I found that if I just went stone cold, that was the most neutral state I could maintain, in which the other person couldn't really like rev up their emotions against me. And so that was a pattern that started to carry over into my adult life. And as a nurse, I also had to maintain this neutrality all the time, especially with dealing with a lot of like patients who struggled with mental health disorders, and they would be extremely reactive and aggressive, and I would just need to be like as neutral as possible. And I found that I often ended up being assigned to more patients like that because I could stay very, very neutral in situations, which is great from a professional standpoint. But the problem with that response was I was never actually processing through the emotions that came up within me. I would feel them and then shut them down before I even recognized the emotions. And then I never had like a debrief after a situation, whether that was like internally kind of journaling about it or in a professional setting, like, all right, let's debrief about this patient who just went crazy and started like throwing stuff at you across the room or grabbed your neck or whatever it was. There was never a debrief. And so the emotion just got like pushed down, and that started to create issues over time and carried over into a lot of different relationships.
Yeah, and I want to take a little bit of time right now to kind of insert a little educational piece here because I think you touched on some really incredible things around trauma that would be helpful to learn a little bit more about as they're hearing you speak. And that if you think of a stoplight, we have green, yellow, and red. And this is how I was taught it is green is like our ventral state. We're in flow state. We're calm. We're regulated. That word regulation is really talking about, okay, I'm green. I'm in ventral. I'm my best self. I'm very, capable of rational thinking. I can place words to my thoughts and feelings. I feel safe and secure. Yellow is fight or flight. So now I'm a little anxious. I'm starting to worry a little bit. I'm not really sure what to do right now. Can't really tap into rational thinking. I'm starting to really feel out of control. That's fight or flight. We're in that space where we're, as our body is literally feeling a threat. So if we're feeling threatened by something, which usually goes about, yeah, perfect. You're sympathetic, right? So your sympathetic is your fight or flight. Your parasympathetic is safety, your down regulation, your rest and digest. When we start to get into fight or flight, that's when all of a sudden our bodies are responding to something external that feels threatening. And the part about trauma that's really challenging is we can, with our eyes, for example, you and I are in a conversation, and I see with my eyes that I'm talking to you. And I know you are safe. I know you're not judging me. I know you are a place of security for me, but I'm still feeling this fight or flight. And so it's this realization that parts of us at the moment that we experience the trauma, that part has now been created and no longer ages. So let's say you had, you're talking about growing up, childhood trauma. If we have a traumatic experience happen to us when we're young, that means that we have a part that could be 3, 7, 12 years old that's still showing up in response to whatever it was, the external stimulus at that time. That threat is now present to the body. Right now we're reading The Body Keeps the Score, and I think this is really helpful, is understanding that our bodies are feeling the threat because there are parts of us that had this experience that we never, like you said, processed through, actually healed, actually spent time learning about how to recreate safety in this place. So those parts of us that are like, again, you see in this picture, rage, anger, we're all of a sudden anxiety, fear, panic. We feel like we almost black out and we're like not really sure what happened or why we're doing what we're doing. We're just like in it. That is a total fight or flight response. And the reason that I brought this up, and again, you went into freeze, and freeze is really like freeze is total, it's dorsal, it's like absolutely just cannot access any sort of functionality. I mean, this is like you feel like it says on here, life threatening. Like your life is threatened and you're so frozen that you can't even move. So understanding these things about our bodies and how parts of us are created out of protection, the parts of you that were created when a traumatic experience happened was because you weren't protected. You did not have safety and you did not have security. Something happened to you. And so now your body feels, this part of you now feels like it has to show up. Otherwise, that same traumatic event is going to happen again to you. So this brings in so much compassion and love and self-awareness in the personal journey, as well as getting to learn your partner and being able to understand that it may not be me, it's a part of what I'm doing is triggering a part of your past self that experienced the trauma. So I just really wanted to point that out because when we talk about regulation on this podcast, when we talk about trauma, it's about understanding that we now have this opportunity to recreate safety with our partners. And this is something that's so deep for me and why I wanted to bring this topic up in romantic relationships and relationships, period, is because we now have an opportunity to recreate that regulated, that parasympathetic part of our nervous system to work through the trauma, process the trauma, heal the trauma, and have our partner be someone that shows us that just because someone's tone is a little bit heightened doesn't have to equal the belt growing up, right? It's like you have provided me a safe place, a ability to connect on a level that brings in, now I can get curious, now I can get fascinated, now I can have a lot more compassion for myself and not feel this shame and guilt because of this uncontrollable response or reaction that I continue to have. I just wanted to point that out because I thought you did an incredible job of sharing kind of how this shows up and having an opportunity for people to see that there is possibility, there is this way in which you can get regulated back into the green, back into ventral, where you have the ability to actually put words to your thoughts, put words to your feelings, and communicate with your partner. That alleviates a lot of these consistent sympathetic activated arguments, or even if it's internally you're feeling triggered with your partner and it's leading to that resentment like we've talked about on previous episodes.
That's great. And I think seeing this chart it's helpful for me visually. If you guys are listening, it may be helpful to watch this video on YouTube as well, so you can kind of get an idea of what these different stages look like. As I come up into that freeze, I think I pass through panic, anxiety for sure, panic, and then I move into that freeze, and it is like this numbness. And it was really interesting reading the notes here about like physiologically what increases in the body. So you're like immobilized, endorphins like numb you, and that numbness is something that's been really overwhelming for me before, because it's almost impossible for me to work through the conversation productively at that point. I'm not there. I have no idea what I feel. I don't even it I have no like productive response available to me. But what was interesting, it was also reading what decreases, and one thing that decreases like your depth of breath and your facial expressions and eye contact and heart rate. And I think that there's a cool way to kind of tap into these states and start to like reverse engineer them if you can, if you are like sure that you're in a safe place, like if you're with your partner and you're feeling triggered, sometimes tapping into the body can be a helpful way to start to like deactivate and come back down into that green state. And for me, like tapping into my breath is really helpful. Like I tend to get kind of like tense, and I like just disengage, and I'm not like visibly like my vision's not like focused on anything, and I start just breathing really shallowly. So to come out of that and get back into a state where I can be more productive, because this isn't a time when I'm available to start like processing through trauma and like, all right, let's heal this child that's been stuck here. I'm not there, I'm not ready, I'm not available. So I need to get back into a state where I can work through this and actually start to heal this on a deeper level. I have to get out of that like freeze state. And for me, using my body is helpful. Like disengage from the situation, breathe a little bit, go for a walk, scan the room and focus on particular things. Like there's different things you can do and use your body to, so you can get back into that green state. So then you can proceed through this conversation or situation with your partner in a way that allows you to start to heal that automatic response and maybe reprogram to a more productive response. And then you're not just stuck in this cycle of repeating patterns from your past. We see, I mean, it's such a cliche, but people say like you are like your parents, like you become, the woman becomes like her mom. Like look at the mom and you'll see what she's going to be like. And it's like, okay, yes, to a degree we do pick up things from our parents. Like we learn how to relate from the people who raised us at the youngest points of our lives. But we also have a lot of power to kind of reprogram these responses if we know how to do so productively and safely, and if we have the benefit of some kind of healthy relationship, even if it's not romantic, in which to start to like practice this and use it as an arena to both identify your natural responses and maybe the responses that aren't serving you anymore. Like freeze does nothing for me. It doesn't really keep me safe in the way that I would like to be. So I can,
Mhm.
with you, recognize when that state's happening, step out of it, kind of come down, and then talk through it with you, and then discuss, all right, here's the story that I'm telling myself. When you said this, my internal feeling was this. Can we change the wording here? Or can we take a timeout? Or finding some productive way to like insert a pause in a situation that normally just starts to follow a pattern.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I want to talk about here what we talked about a little bit yesterday about the stories that we're telling ourselves, because I think the point that you're making, I loved it in the beginning and we can tie it back in, is because we've experienced trauma, it's going to change our perception. It's going to change the assumptions that we make. It's whether it's conscious or not, it's still very much affecting the way that we connect. And connection is so, so, so significant. It is absolutely one of the, if not the best way to reprogram, because our brains, neuroplasticity is a real thing. Like we can actually reprogram our brains and be able to respond differently and work through trauma and achieve this ability to choose how we respond, because that choice is not really there when we're experiencing trauma, when we're triggered and we're not aware of it. It's like it almost doesn't feel like we have a choice. It's just what happens. And being able to reestablish connection in a way where you're also then assessing the stories that you're telling, not only yourself but about your partner, is a great way to engage in that kind of conversation of like, I'm telling this story in my head. Can you verify that story for me? Or, hey, this is just how I'm perceiving this. Instead of reacting upon the story and just assuming that that story is true, we say this a lot: assume best intentions, right? Assume that the story you're telling yourself, if it's negative, that you need to ask your partner, because that might not be true. It's like everything we think is not always true. And I know we talked, like, that TikTok video might be a cool link to add to the description of this about leadership. But when you're going into an interaction and you're reading all of the nonverbal communication that's happening, you're starting to create a story. Facts are facts, and when you're starting to try to create meaning, because that's what we do as human beings, is create meaning, we're trying to make all of these narratives, essentially they're coming to life in our actual reality, where if you become aware of the story you're telling yourself, that also will answer some questions as to why you may be doing what you're doing or thinking about what you're thinking about, which could then lead you to the root of trauma that you can then actually start to address, which is great. But also your partner can understand what's happening in your mind and be able to validate the story, actually share the truth about the story. And then that is now, instead of you acting on your story and me acting on my story, and now our stories are like all just like this and we're fighting and we're arguing, it's like, no, let's talk about, this is how that is being perceived in my mind and how other behaviors are playing into this. Can you help me understand where you're actually coming from? Because I don't want to have this resentment towards you. And I don't want to feel like you're not prioritizing something that's really significant to me, like my health, for example. So I just wanted to bring that piece in there, because I think that's a tool that a lot of people, if they could step out of that, could remove so many, just in daily interactions, could completely transform the lens that they have on the world, from a lens of everyone's out to get me, judgment, again, comparison, like you said, to let me love. How can I show love? How can I have compassion? How can I help? I think those different way of thinking, having that new lens, can significantly transform not only the frequency that you're emitting into the world, but it now allows for there to be an actual dynamic that is safe and secure, brings you back into ventral, and actually creates this opportunity for truth to be revealed.
It's super powerful. I think the one of the most powerful things we have are the stories that we tell, and this showed up in this shows up in all of our relationships really, but that video, and I'll put a link to it above. It In it, the speaker talked about how the story that we tell shapes our experience, but it also shapes our response to a person. So if we see a person and we assume something about them, we're going to treat them based on the assumption, then they are going to react based on the way that we treated them, often fulfilling that assumption. So, for instance, I was at jujitsu and there was a girl who was like much better than me and just very intimidating to me. Like I felt very threatened. And I I didn't realize I was doing it, but because I felt threatened, I was pretty standoffish with her. Like I wasn't really engaging her. And when she would give me like a tip, I would kind of like, I would just like nod and like do it, but I wasn't really giving her much back. And because of that, she was pretty resistant to engaging with me as well, which then fulfilled my expectation of like, she's a bitch, which is not true at all. Then after class, I'm sorry I said that, guys, but that's how the dark side of my brain works sometimes. after class, the next day, actually, she wasn't there, and I spoke to the instructor, like, wow, she really threw me around. Like, I was giving her some kudos. But he told me a little bit about her story as a person, and it really opened my eyes to like just how incredible her journey has been and some of the challenges she'd been through. Like, she'd lost her brother recently, like all of this stuff. And it totally changed my perspective of her, and I developed, like, immediately this sense of respect that I didn't have the day before because I made an assumption about her that she just as like, didn't wanna roll with me because 'cause I'm, like, no good, and she, like, knows she's better than me, so she's looking down at me. I made all this up in my head, and none of that was true, but because I was acting out of that, she was responding to that. And then the next day, I was like, "I'm gonna be like, I'm just gonna go in with the best of intentions. Now that I know all this, and I wish I had acted out of that initially, I can go in there." And I decided, I went up and like shook her hand at the beginning of class, and I like thanked her and I complimented her, and like I asked her some questions because I really wanted to learn from her once I was open to doing so. And her reaction to me shifted like immediately. And now I'm like, oh, I feel super comfortable with her, and she's so kind and not what I thought at all. But I was
Mhm.
creating the story, and the story was shaping my experience and her experience, and it totally put a wall up to love, which is the problem, right? There's that comparison piece coming in again. It's that divisiveness. So the stories that we tell have the potential to create love and connection in our lives, or to create fear and divisiveness. And we are ultimately the ones who get to decide the story that we tell. And it's so powerful. And if you find yourself frustrated in a certain situation, go to the story that you're telling yourself about it and ask, can I rewrite this? Can I apply a new meaning? If I'm getting into the same situation with my partner every time, if we get in an argument and your voice starts coming up because that's part of your reactive pattern, and I start shutting down, the story I'm telling myself is, you don't respect me, you're going to leave me, like, you think I'm stupid, you're looking down on me, like all this stuff. And then I'm acting like that towards you. And then I'm not responding to you. And then when I don't say anything to you, you're like feeling like I don't hear you or respect you. So it's just like
Right.
vicious cycle, but we have everything we need to stop it, to rewire it, and to create something positive out of it.
Yeah, and that's so crazy that that last statement, because I do think it's really important to emphasize here that we do need other people. We need other people from a connection standpoint to help create a safe environment to heal, because trauma happened because of other people as well, So there's this weird dichotomy of like, yeah, well, people caused the trauma, but I'm supposed to trust people and connect. And it's like, yes. And that is where boundaries are super important, like we talked about before, establishing boundaries. But the other big part of this is that you are ultimately the one that is going to be your own healer. You need other people to connect with to help you to establish safety and security in new environments, because you can't recreate something that happened without there being another person. So having other people is super significant to helping you recreate safety when it comes to these environments. And obviously there are situations with trauma where EMDR and doing some other very intensive therapy is going to be necessary to uproot that fight or flight or that freeze state. Sometimes regulation and conversation is not the modality that you need, because of whatever the trauma was so significant that it needs to be a much more in a very structured practice with a registered professional. Absolutely. I'm definitely not saying that you can just heal all of your deep trauma just by having a connection with another person. My main point in all of this, though, is you have the tools that you need to recreate safety internally for yourself. And it is not finding security in another person. It's about finding security in self, which is what your point about the insecurity that comes up in relationship. When we experience insecurity in relationship, it's as if we don't feel whole on our own. And so, regardless of if you've been through trauma, regardless of if you have reactionary behaviors, you still have to be the parent. And we can talk a little bit more about internal family systems in our next series, and a little bit more about how our bodies and our minds and our spirits are all one thing, they're all connected. But you, as your highest self, your best self, your regulated self, that is a part of you, just like these other parts are. And so being able to choose that part in that specific situation, do the regulation tool that helps you create that safety and calm again, then having the healthy dynamic with another person is going to be how co-regulation, that word, is truly going to impact the healing process. So I just want to be really clear with that, because I think in my personal journey, I was trying to find that security in other people, or in number of likes on Instagram, or how many people were commenting on my body, whatever. Anything external is not going to provide you that wholesome feeling that actually leads to true regulation and groundedness. So I just wanted to put that out there, because it's really important to know that we need other people, but that we also must be our own healer. When we have a part of us that comes up, say, for me, there's a part of me that was traumatized at a young age, and that young version of me that needed to always be right, for example, or like assert my power in an argument, was super young. And once I got calm again, once I got back to my ventral state, realized like I didn't want, that was so not who I am. That was so not who I want to be. And now when that part will come up to try to protect, which it doesn't as much anymore because I've gone through this healing process, I know in myself, like, it's okay, we're safe. You know that this is just coming up because you're feeling a little bit of a power struggle, you know? Let's, I will literally say to myself, I will like go envision myself holding that version of myself, letting that version of myself know, hey, we're safe here. It's okay. Use your words. What is it that you really need? What is it that you really want? Because most of the time, anger is a cover up emotion for being hurt. And I needed to start using my voice about what I really needed in the situation. So, understanding that you are your own healer, you're the only one that's been with you all of your life. And you can go back and hold that person, that smaller self, or the part of you that shows up, and tell that part of you that I understand that no one was there for you at this time when it happened. There was no one there to help you. And I didn't help you, aka like higher self. I didn't protect me. But I'm here now, and this is a very different environment. And let me show you how we can recreate safety here. Start to actually parent your inner parts that come up and show up to recreate that sense of safety, knowing then because we've established trust and we've established this boundary, we've talked, we've communicated, we've built this connection. I know that you are going to hear me. So now that part comes with me. I'm holding that part and I say, it really hurt me when you did that, because I felt like you were coming at my level of intelligence, as an example. It's like now you can say, no, I'm so sorry. I hear you completely. I totally wasn't doing that. This was me just feeding off of the conversation we were having. I just wanted to continue the dialogue. And so now all of a sudden it's like that part can be like, oh, okay. It's okay. I'm okay. I'm safe. And now I'm coming back into my calm. We can have these conversations. And now it's like, wow, we really just worked through some stuff, and now I'm already starting to heal that part that has been blocking my highest self from showing up.
Yes, and I think your point about having established trust is huge, and that's why I think there are times when therapy is just going to be necessary. Like there are things we have to work through on our own, and then our relationships are these like amazing, hopefully safe and healthy arenas in which to practice these things. But there's a lot of self work that has to take place as well. Very open communication and just honesty with your partner about like there may come a point where one or the other of you is dealing with something and the partner has to say like, hey, I'm not sure how to help you here, or I'm not sure how to meet you in this area. Maybe we can do therapy together. Maybe it would be helpful to talk to someone else because there can come a point where you're trying to like get your partner to heal you or save you, and that's that balance. And I have a graphic pulled up here. It's like trauma bonding versus authentic bonding, and it's like in trauma bonding, you're looking to that person to complete you, to save you. You're giving everything to make sure you can keep their love. Whereas in authentic bonding, you're saying like, you fully accept me as I am, but you can also challenge me to grow. We can grow together, but I also am whole on my own. So it's like you said the other day, it's like we're both whole, like we're like yin and yang, but we're our own whole pieces. But then together we can be this even
Yeah.
greater thing, but we have to be whole on our own first. Because if we come to each other without actively pursuing healing, obviously we're going to be broken people. Like we have trauma in our lives. We live in an imperfect, sinful world. We're going to have brokenness, but we should actively work on our side of things so we can come together and have so much more light and joy and passion and healing. But that self work has to come first. And that's why you'll hear a lot of people say, like, they just need to be alone for a while, or like you should probably take some time out of a relationship in between relationships. And it's because we have a responsibility to work through some of these things on our own or with a professional who's outside of our relationship until we can get to that point where we understand the responsibility of that which we need to work on our own, and then that which we can work with our partner on so that we can start to heal some of these patterns in more of a like real time situation.
Yeah, and I think this is a perfect segue into our episode next week and starting the new um series, because as we were looking at that first graphic as well, I realized even further how my POTS situation was 100% because I was in freeze. And I didn't even realize I was in freeze, So we can kind of talk about the reason I think this is a perfect segue is because you're talking about wholeness. You're talking about wholeness, and wholeness is absolutely our whole being, mind, body, spirit. We are whole. And to try to separate trauma to be this strictly mental experience is totally unrealistic. Trauma and its impact on us as whole beings is a mind, body, and spiritual journey of recreating this and feeling at home in ourselves. And I just think speaking to coming into that wholeness requires that you are assessing not only your mental health, but your physical health and your spiritual health. All three of those things must be in alignment to reach this level of whole being wellness, if we want to call it that. And to me, it's super powerful to know that you have to take care of all of you to truly heal. You have to take care of all of you. And it's not about asserting this level of control. It's just about gaining this understanding of who you are in your entirety, which means understanding what your body's communication style is, understanding what your body needs and wants from a nourishment perspective and a movement perspective, and being able to eliminate any sort of diet culture or eliminate any sort of worldly rules to how you're functioning is going to be extremely significant. And so, I think you can debrief the next series a little bit more, but talking about, obviously I'm a little bit more on the mental side, but my trauma, my freeze response was all because I was not taking the time to listen to my body. And so as much as mental work as you can do, having your mental be also aligned with your clarity of your physical body, which is what's going to inform you. It's your intuition. Your inner world is inside this case. And our bodies are so smart. They are talking to us constantly about what they need, what it needs. And it's our spirit. If we can tap into our spirit while we're doing all of that, that's when we actually understand truth and we can gather this sense of peace, even in the midst of all of this crazy pain and suffering that happens in the world. It's uniting all three things together, taking into account, how do I really gather healthy behaviors in my mind, controlling my thoughts, and really applying a lens of love and compassion. How do I start to move appropriately for my body and fuel myself appropriately for what it is that I'm doing or want to do? And then also, where is my being? Where am I at spiritually? Am I truly seeking out this level of surrender to the source, God, obviously for us, but whatever that higher power is that you believe in, that is truly your guide. So what is your relationship like to that experience, or that, um just beyond any sort of like language or understanding? It's so hard to explain. Assessing all three of those areas is going to be crucial to really achieving wholeness.
Definitely. Like, we're not just physical, but we're not just spiritual either. And I think sometimes there are camps of like, you know, people who think it's all physical and they totally ignore the spiritual side. And that's like the very like science community. And then there's the opposite where it's like our bodies don't really matter and nothing really matters except our souls. And it's like, and there's total neglect of physical needs and nourishment. And I think you and I have both kind of learned in our own journeys, both going kind of like in both in the same directions at times, but also in the extreme opposites and coming back to that middle of like, here's what it looks like. Like whole being wellness involves all of these aspects. So that's introducing our next series, really, is this idea of whole being wellness. And that's something that you and I work on together and actually coach people to together with this combined like health coaching and life coaching and helping people get to that point where they're just optimized in their lives and experiencing the most sense of like wholeness and fullness and wellness and joy. And it takes into account all these different areas of our lives. And I'm excited. We're going to start breaking that down and give you guys some like tangible steps for how to start improving your lives in all of these areas that really build the foundation of wellness. And I'm really excited to start breaking it down because this is like both of our jam, and we'll give you a little bit of insight into what it would look like to work one on one with us as well. If you wanted to get into something that was a little bit more personalized. So I'm really thankful for you guys just following this relationship series. I've gotten some great feedback, awesome questions. It's really cool to get your like engagement with questions in your life. And I think this next series is going to be a really great way to just kind of take your own journey to the next level, challenge yourself in a new way. We're a few months past the new year, and this is a time of the year where like summer's coming and there's the excitement and people are starting to get a little bit more energy, but those like New Year's resolutions start to wear off at this point. So having a new way to shift your focus into setting some goals and figuring out how you can still work to improve your life is helpful at this point in the year. And we tend to start to have the energy to start to invest in ourselves in this way as well. So should be awesome timing. Um, and on that, we'll wrap up the series. Thank you guys for liking, watching, supporting. Please be sure to comment, share this series, and stay tuned next week. And we will kick off our next series on whole being wellness.